On its side, in a granite quarry in southern Egypt, lies a stone that was never meant to be found unfinished. It is 137 feet long, weighs an estimated 1,100 tons, and if it had been completed, it would have been the largest single piece of work stone ever raised by human hands in the ancient world. A crack split through it near the end of its extraction, and the workers, who had spent months freeing it from the bedrock, simply stopped. They walked away and never came back. For 3,000 years, it has lain there in the Aswan quarries, a monument to ambition that broke against the limits of stone. That is the story most people are told, and for a long time it was enough. But if you walk the trenches around that obelisk today and look closely at the granite itself, you start to notice something the standard story never quite explains, and once you see it, it is hard to stop asking questions. The marks are everywhere in these quarries, cut into some of the hardest rock ancient people ever worked. They are shallow scoop-shaped depressions, a few inches wide and a couple of inches deep, repeated over and over across long stretches of stone. On their own, they would not seem strange. Egyptologists have known about these marks for more than a century, and the explanation taught in textbooks is straightforward. Workers used rounded balls of a volcanic rock called dolerite, nearly as hard as the granite itself, and pounded the surface again and again until enough material broke away to carve out a trench deep enough to separate a block from the bedrock. Thousands of these dolerite hammerstones have actually been found scattered through the Aswan quarries, many of them worn down to nubs from use and discarded once they became too small to be effective. This part of the story is not in dispute. It is documented, physical, and consistent with how a Bronze Age civilization, without hardened metal tools, would have had to work. Granite is punishingly hard stone, somewhere around 6 to 7 on the Mohs hardness scale. Copper, the main metal the Egyptians worked in large quantities, sits at around 3. Bronze is only a little harder. Neither would hold an edge against granite for more than a few strikes before deforming. So percussion, patient, repetitive, brute force percussion with harder stone against softer stone, is the only method that makes physical sense within what we know the Egyptians actually had. Modern, experimental archaeologists have tested this. They have taken dolerite balls out into quarries, some of them in Aswan itself, and pounded away at granite surfaces to see what results. The technique works. Given enough time and enough labor, you absolutely can shape granite this way. Trenches can be dug. Blocks can be separated. The dolerite method is real, and it is almost certainly what quarried the vast majority of the granite that ended up in Egyptian obelisks, sarcophagi, and temple columns. The problem, and the reason this topic still generates debate rather than a settled answer, is that when you look closely at the surface texture the experiments produce compared to what actually exists on many of the quarry walls, the two do not always match as cleanly as you would expect. Hand pounding, even skilled, well-practiced hand pounding, tends to leave rough, uneven surfaces. Every blow lands with slightly different force. Fatigue sets in over hours of labor. Different workers strike from different angles. The result should be, and largely is, a somewhat chaotic texture when you examine it up close. Yet in a number of locations throughout the Aswan quarries, sections of the stone show marks that look considerably more uniform than that, smoother curves, more evenly spaced grooves, patterns that some researchers argue look less like the record of thousands of individual, slightly different impacts, and more like the trace of a tool moving through the stone in a controlled, repeating motion. This is where the conversation splits, and it is worth being honest about that split rather than pretending it does not exist. Mainstream Egyptology has generally responded to these observations by pointing out that stone tool marks can look far more regular than people assume, especially once you factor in skilled, specialized labor crews who did this work for a living and likely developed refined, practiced techniques passed down over generations, along with finishing processes involving copper tools and abrasive sand that would smooth over the roughest evidence of the initial percussion work. In this view, what looks like suspiciously perfect uniformity is simply the product of experienced hands and additional finishing steps that experimental archaeology, often carried out by amateurs over a few days rather than professionals over a lifetime, does not fully replicate. This is a reasonable and evidence-based position. and it is the one held by the overwhelming majority of archaeologists who specialize in ancient Egyptian stoneworking. On the other side of the debate are researchers, some credentialed and some independent, who argue that certain sections of the Aswan quarries show a level of consistency that is difficult to explain through hand labor alone, no matter how skilled the workers were. They point to trenches cut into awkward, tightly confined spaces, corners, and narrow gaps where swinging a heavy stone hammer with any real force would have been physically difficult. Yet where the surrounding marks look no different from marks made in wide open areas where a full swinging motion would have been easy. They point to narrow vertical shafts found throughout the quarry complex, cut 30 to 50 feet down into solid granite, while only 3 or 4 feet wide. Spaces so tight that pounding effectively, clearing away broken rock debris, and simply breathing while working at the bottom would all have been serious practical challenges. Conventional archaeology explains these shafts as test pits, dug to check the quality and consistency of the granite before committing months of labor to extracting a massive block, which is a sensible and likely largely correct explanation for their purpose. What some researchers question is not why the pits were dug, but how they were dug so consistently under such difficult physical conditions using only hand tools and stone hammers. It is important to slow down here, because this is exactly the point where a lot of online content about ancient Egypt tends to leap from a genuine, open question into a confident claim about lost technology, ancient machinery, or forgotten civilizations, without the evidence actually supporting that leap. The honest answer is that no rotary tools, no powered cutting devices, and no depictions of anything beyond copper chisels, wooden mallets, and stone hammers have ever been found in the archaeological record of ancient Egypt. There are no Egyptian texts describing such devices. There is no art depicting them. If sophisticated mechanical tools existed, they left behind absolutely no trace beyond a handful of debated surface textures that skeptics argue can plausibly be explained by skilled traditional methods anyway. Extraordinary claims of ancient machinery require extraordinary evidence, and right now what exists is a genuine, unresolved disagreement among people who study these quarries closely about how uniform certain marks really are and what that uniformity does or does not imply, not confirmed proof of any lost technology. What nobody disputes is that the unfinished obelisk itself is a spectacular piece of physical evidence for just how ambitious and how constrained ancient Egyptian engineering really was. The crack that ended the project appears to have formed naturally within the granite as workers cut deeper, a flaw invisible from the surface that only revealed itself once the extraction was well underway. Rather than risk the entire block shattering during the difficult process of separating it from the bedrock, the project was abandoned. This alone tells us something important. The Egyptians were working at the very edge of what their methods and materials allowed. An object of this scale, over 1,000 tons of solid rose granite, was only attempted because earlier obelisks of similar but smaller scale had already been successfully quarried, transported down the Nile, and erected at temple sites hundreds of miles away, an engineering achievement that remains genuinely staggering even without invoking any lost technology at all. Consider what moving a completed obelisk of this material actually required. Once freed from a bedrock, a granite obelisk weighing several hundred tons had to be levered onto sledges, dragged across specially prepared and lubricated surfaces by enormous teams of laborers, loaded onto barges built specifically to carry weight of this magnitude down the Nile during flood season when water levels were high enough to support the load, then unloaded and dragged again to its final position, and finally raised upright using ramps, counterweights, and ropes, all without a single piece of iron machinery, all coordinated across a workforce that had to be fed, housed, and organized for months at a time. Whatever debates exist about the precise texture of certain quarry marks, this logistical achievement alone places Egyptian engineering among the most impressive undertakings of the ancient world, achieved entirely through organization, ingenuity, and an extraordinary understanding of leverage, friction, and materials available to them at the time. The rose granite of Aswan was worth all of this effort because of what it represented. It was rare, it was beautiful, flecked with dark and light crystals against a pink background, and it was durable in a way few other stones could match. Monuments carved from it nearly 5,000 years ago still stand today with remarkably little weathering, a testament to why Egyptian builders prized it for their most sacred structures. Obelisks meant to catch the first light of the rising sun, sarcophagi meant to protect a pharaoh for eternity, and temple columns meant to outlast every dynasty that would ever rule the Nile. Choosing to work with a stone this difficult, when softer limestone was abundant and far easier to shape, tells us something about Egyptian priorities. They were willing to spend enormous amounts of labor, specifically because the difficulty of the material was part of what made the final object valuable and sacred. So, where does that leave the mystery? It leaves it exactly where honest, careful research usually leaves ancient history, somewhere between full certainty and total unknown. The dolerite pounding method is real, documented, and sufficient to explain the vast majority of granite extraction at Aswan. Some specific marks in some specific locations remain genuinely debated among specialists, not because there is secret evidence of ancient machines being suppressed, but because reconstructing exactly how skilled a Bronze Age labor crew could get at a repetitive physical task, sustained over years of practice, is inherently difficult to test in a modern experiment that only runs for a few days. It is entirely possible, arguably likely, that the answer to the more puzzling marks is simply that we have underestimated how refined purely manual techniques could become in the hands of specialists who did nothing else for their entire working lives, generation after generation, passing down small refinements in technique that never made it into any written record because it was ordinary, everyday craft knowledge rather than something worth documenting. That is a less dramatic conclusion than lost civilizations or forgotten machines. But it is also the conclusion best supported by the actual archaeological record as it stands. The unfinished obelisk and the quarries around it do not need embellishment to be remarkable. A civilization organizing tens of thousands of workers, moving 1,000-ton stones hundreds of miles without wheels suited to the terrain or engines of any kind, and carving durable monuments that still stand after nearly 5,000 years, using nothing harder than volcanic rock and copper, is already one of the most impressive stories in human history. The debate over a handful of unusually smooth surface marks is a genuine and interesting scientific question, one that specialists continue to study and argue about using careful measurement rather than speculation, but it remains an open question rather than proof of anything beyond what we already know these builders were capable of. Walking through the Aswan quarries today, past discarded dolerite balls worn smooth from thousands of forgotten impacts, past the narrow test shafts cut deep into solid rock, past the great cracked obelisk, still lying exactly where its makers left it, you get a sense of a civilization working right at the edge of its own limits, sometimes succeeding beyond what seems reasonable, and sometimes failing in ways that were preserved by accident rather than design. The stone does not need a hidden explanation to be extraordinary. It is extraordinary because ordinary people using ordinary tools organize themselves well enough to attempt something this difficult in the first place, and mostly, astonishingly, they pulled it off. The unfinished obelisk is the one time they did not, and it survives today not as evidence of some greater mystery, but as a rare, honest glimpse of ancient ambition meeting the hard limits of the material itself, cracked, abandoned, and left exactly as it was found, still asking questions that careful research is still working to answer.